Well, thanks a lot for staying with us here on Sunrise Live on E on this wonderful, thoughtful Thursday. Now, looking at Brazil, Russia, India, China, as well as South Africa, they're basically known as the BRICS countries. They've developed a new action plan in order to strengthen industrial relations as well as cooperation between them. Now, the plan significantly focuses on industrial policies as well as the coordination and development of small businesses, amongst other things. So joining us in studio this morning to elaborate further about this 7-point plan, as well as where we're currently standing with the BRICS Development Bank, I'm joined by Roxanne Francis from the BRICS Journal. Of course, to be part of the conversation this morning, you simply leave your comments on our Facebook as well as our Twitter pages, and we can also take in some of those comments. Roxanne, thanks a lot for joining us this morning. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Faye.
Now, when we're looking at the BRICS Development Bank, it's one big talking point. I think we should start off there because it is officially launching in Sandton this morning. So straight after this interview with me, you're going straight into Sandton just to get into the launch of it. They've changed the name, though. It's no longer called the BRICS Development Bank, but rather the New Development Bank. Tell us about the thinking behind it.
Correct. So initial idea with the BRICS Development Bank was obviously to limit it within the 5 BRICS nations. But now, because of emerging markets and their influence on all the markets, they've decided to extend it, and it's now called the New Development Bank. So as to include emerging markets as well, and business and trade between.
So when we take saying that emerging markets, so in other words, Kenya, for example, which will be seen as an emerging market.
That's correct.
What is that other country now? Not Sierra Leone. It's Kenya, Kigali.
Oh, yes.
Rwanda. There we go. Rwanda will be seen as an emerging country.
That's correct. So the rest of Africa as well, they're hoping to include. So it's not just South Africa as a unit, but then Africa as a whole.
Okay, so now when we're looking at the launch in itself, I mean, in this one comes in because Nhlanhla Nene, the former finance minister, was actually earmarked to be the one that is heading up the BRICS Development Bank.
That's correct. It's no longer the case. He was in the running for it, but it's no longer the case. They have not as yet identified who will be running it up from South Africa's perspective, but it's going to be interesting to see.
So this is going to be launching without a person spearheading it?
I think we'll probably find out later today, but so far, yes, the president of the New Development Bank in the world, Mr. Kamath, he's here today, so I know that they'll obviously have a lot of influence from China and from where they're running it, but it's going to be interesting to see. So there's as yet nobody yet, but we'll find that out today. I think they're making a lot of big announcements today. Okay,
and then in your views about it, I mean, before we extend into just the relationship as well as the 7-point plan, but your views about it, because a lot of times it appears as though it's a very government-to-government kind of a strategy that is supposed to be going forward. In other words, if you want to access trade and trade agreements within that framework, and then you want to get access to capital, that's where the BRICS Development Bank or the New Development Bank actually comes in. But how far does it extend right down to the small business? In other words, extend, getting access to some of the capital for some of the businesses that they want to implement, let's say, in other countries?
Look, when they spoke about it earlier this year in China, at one of the summits in China, their big focus was youth. So they definitely want to get a lot of youth, a lot of young people involved, which is why they're extending it to small businesses and not just keeping it, and especially with the rise of small business in South Africa now and in Africa as a whole. So they're extending it so that it's not just exclusive. They want to make it all-inclusive, whether it be for bigger businesses, but also SMEs. There's a big focus on SMEs. So they're trying to bring it as close to home as possible for the ordinary citizen.
And then the 7-point plan, I know that... And here's the thing with the 7-point plan. I know that you and I cringe a little bit with the 7-point plan. So we were cringing a little bit about the 7-point plan simply because of it appears as though it's the same words. So the same words that have been used extensively over and over again. We need to strengthen relations. We need to tie up our loose ends. We need to give collaboration, that wonderful word. And how is it that we can collaborate? So the 7-point plan significantly focuses as well on the new industrial revolution, or for some of us, we know it as the 4th industrial revolution, as articulated by the World Economic Forum. Take us through just that plan.
Okay, so for me as well, it's like you were saying, it was a little bit of a frustration because all you hear is collaboration and, we want to just join forces. But finally, a plan has been put into place where you sort of say, you know what, I don't necessarily think we should see the industrial revolution as a threat. I think jump on the bandwagon. It does sort of minimize a lot of labor, traditional production and workflow. But I do think let's jump on the bandwagon. Let's not be enemies of technology. Let's in fact join in. So I think that's what, and in explaining that's what Minister Rob Davies was saying. It's sort of including, and sort of understanding that you cannot be moving forward and then hating on, to put it that way, hating on the technology and the Industrial Revolution.
But let's have an honest conversation between you and I. When we're looking at some of the investment opportunities that have come out or that have been made public in the media regarding some of those investments by BRICS, it's still a very highly contested kind of relationship. What's a fragile relationship between the BRICS countries, never mind the developing countries that are going to be coming onto the bandwagon as a result of the new development bank. But currently, the BRICS countries themselves, there are still areas of improvement that are needed. For example, Brazil, Portuguese country, right? Significantly relying on trade relations between those that are Portuguese speaking. So what trade agreements and significant agreements are coming out of Brazil alone? Russia, the only thing we're seeing coming out of Russia at this particular moment in time is those nuclear related agreements, right? So most of the agreements are nuclear related, and how do we access that? India, we've seen a significant increase. China, of course, they've capacitated the African continent within the next 2 years with $60 billion. So what significant room of improvement is there, especially when you look at Brazil?
That's correct. Look, I see Brazil's obviously coming out of the financial crisis, or the global crisis, as we put it. I do think it's the changing the positioning of Africa. Let's not see Africa as sort of the the child that, oh, let's help them up.
The welfare child.
That's correct. And I think that if we can change focus to that, and if that can be, because that's our views on it, but if that can be government's views as well, let's change our positioning as Africa, because honestly, if you look at manufacturing, we are so rich as a continent and as a country, so rich in natural resources as well as human resources. So let's take it up top there. Let's not be sort of playing second to Brazil and second to all of those. And I think, considering the worldwide financial crisis and economic crisis that we're in, let's sort of look to bettering that. Let's look at matchmaking, for example. What Brazil is doing wonderfully that South Africa needs a bit of help with, and what South Africa is doing wonderfully that Brazil can learn from.
What is Brazil doing wonderfully that South Africa needs to get a hold of?
There's a lot of things, we know Brazil and the coffee and all of that, but there's a lot more. There's a lot more that can be dug into.
Okay, so when we're looking at the strategy that was previously in place, right? Yes. So the initial strategy, I think that it was the launch in Moscow.
Yes,
that we saw the actual coming up of the BRICS and the BRICS countries, the development bank, all those kinds of speeches. What was missing in that strategy that is now being implemented with the 7-point plan, and what's going to be so different about it this time around?
I think once again it was talk. It was talk. It's like, let's get into action. I think sort of what has brought us to a point of action now is the fact that the world leaders and industry ministers realize that, we sort of have a crisis now. So let's work at whatever everyone is good at. So use your strengths, basically. Use your strengths, and let's build from that.
Okay, so the initial launch of itself as well, we're speaking a little bit about how small businesses are going to be able to access that capital and access that funding.
Yes,
are we as yet in the know in terms of exactly how the mechanics of that BRICS Development Bank is going to work, or the new development bank is going to work? In other words, am I going to walk in there and say, listen guys, I need about 50 million rand because I'm building a bridge in Kenya, and I need to be able to access that capital, and do we know the stringent measures and the terms and conditions that have been put in place for those individuals and even businesses and corporates that want to access that kind of funding for the purpose of the developing countries?
The mechanics are not have not been made known as yet, but I do think what it's going to do is give SMEs and a lot of other businesses, it's going to give us more access and easier access. Usually there was a whole process that you need to go through, and you end up 5-10 years later you still haven't gotten approval, or you still haven't gotten the nod. So I think this time around it's bringing it closer to home, and actually you sitting as a businessman and as an entrepreneur, sitting down and saying, okay, here's my business plan, this is what I have, and this is what I think, where I feel that I could benefit.
What's the relationship like in terms of the BRICS countries currently? And I'm just doing it from a perspective of the overview, right? So we know that Brazil has just come out of their financial crisis as a result of having the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff, etc. So they've gone through their own political upheaval as well as economic upheaval. Russia is still in the fold there as well, even though they're going through their issues with the United States. India, which is coming up as one of the big players when it comes to the industries, as well as China. So where does South Africa play a role in that, and how influential is that role?
I think South Africa's role is increasing. It's really increasing. I think especially between China and India, as you were saying, Brazil, sort of coming up as well. Russia's also getting closer and closer, their relations with the US, obviously. So I think the strengthening between the focus with India is young people as well. China, we know they're big in consumer, and that's what they focus on.
India with young people, how?
That's correct. we were at the BRICS trade fair last year, a lot, I would say about 80% of businesses and of entrepreneurs would be under the age of 35.
Okay.
So that was quite interesting to note.
So this with the context of India.
This is the context of India, and also the number one question that we got was like, how can I get my product into South Africa? What can I do? Who do I have to go through? And you can't just tell them work through trade and industry, because they know that. They're like, okay, but sometimes it's a, you know,
there's
blockage.
A lot of red tape.
That's the thing. So I think they appreciate the one-on-one, and that's why earlier this year there was also the BRICS Youth Fair, where it's, you know, I sit down as a young entrepreneur and you sit down and let's talk how we can collaborate. We are still, it's almost 8 months later, we are still getting feedback and still getting emails from Chinese entrepreneurs and Indian, as well as Brazil and Russia.
Okay, so of course it's about how is it that those relationships and those initial talks can actually extend to business being done, and how then do we start capacitating some of those businesses to get access to that capital to carry out some of those initiatives that have been articulated?
I think, you know, the important thing is open communication, and it's an honest communication as well. I think if we as a country, if we know that, you know what, we're struggling and we have some backfalls, let's be honest. I think that's where it lies as well, because at first it was like, you know, it's a great idea and it's a great initiative in the air, but practically coming down, what are we saying, and what is our weakness? Let's just be honest. What is our weakness, and let's see where we can help each other.